I think it's worthwhile to take a step back and really think about what are the questions, right? When we think about Chanuka, we're celebrating the miracle of the Pach Hashem and the miracle of the oil, but we're also celebrating a particular military victory over the Greeks, over the Hellenizers. We're celebrating a battle essentially where the Jews won. But in many cases as well, we're celebrating the victory of our culture, which was under threat. And to a modern reader of the story of Chanuka, we're faced with a question. Are we dealing with extremists, so to speak? Are we dealing with fanatics? And how does that sit with us? Are we celebrating fundamentalism on Chanuka, so to speak? Are we celebrating this aspect? Many people ask this question in not necessarily in Frum forums, but more broadly, that have said it's pretty funny that the most assimilated Jews are the ones who celebrate a victory of fundamentalists over what was essentially an international culture. But I think before we begin, because we're going to look at it from a slightly different angle, just to kind of dispel any confused notions. The Greek oppression of Am Yisrael was very, very real. The decrees against Am Yisrael was very, very real. The threat to Jewish civilization was very, very real. And the Maccabees, as we'll see, were fighting to preserve Jewish identity, and in many ways succeeded. And we need also to understand from that perspective, there is a time to fight if you need to defend Am Yisrael and protect Jewish values. And certainly during the time of the Greek oppression, that was one of those times. But it does launch us into this question of how do we feel about kanaut, we would say in Hebrew, zeal, perhaps fanaticism. What are the extent to fanaticism? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing in Judaism? I'm the Rav from Mizrahi, and Mizrahi in many ways is always associated with the merging of modernity and Torah, and perhaps some might say compromising Torah in order to be part of the modern world, whereas perhaps there are other streams of Judaism that are more true to the Torah way, so to speak. And does that mean therefore I'm against fanaticism? How do I deal with that? And where does that put me? A broader question which perhaps we all ask ourselves from time to time. Are we Hellenists in some respects? Are we kind of assimilating? Does it require inherent fanaticism to preserve Jewish identity in any scenario? Or is it only during persecutions? And all these kinds of questions. But our angle into this question is we're going to look at the figure of Levi, right, in the Tanakh, because Levi is associated with many stories of kanaut, of you may say fanaticism or zeal, and is rewarded accordingly. And we'll see these stories. We're going to look at the story of, just quickly, not go into it in great depth, but the story of Shechem with Levi and Shimon. We're going to look at the story of Har Sinai and Chet HaEgel, and we're also going to look at the story of Pinchas, right, and how that affects our notions of kanaut, our notions of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and hopefully we'll come out of it as well with a bit of an insight into Chanuka. So I'm going to share my screen, Birshutchem, now, and then we'll be off, so to speak. Does anyone have any comments or questions at this point? Okay. Well, you know what? I have a question. See if people would want to answer. Does anyone here consider themselves a fanatic in the religious sphere, or is there something that you're fanatical about, do you think?
Well, it depends who you want.
I'm asking you, Peretz.
We might, if you're in certain circles, like possibly people who might be less religious than ourselves would see us as being a bit fanatical.
Right.
But then people who might be in different circles see us being as more Hellenistic.
Right, that's true. It's all relative, you're saying.
I would say in situations I could be fanatic if I feel the necessity for it.
Yeah.
But overall, I always try to be moderate. But there may be cases where you have to stand up and make a point. That's certainly true.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. So let's begin with the Ramban on Bereshit Memtet, where he's actually talking about the bracha that's given to Shevet Yehuda. The bracha is that Yehuda will always be the king of Israel, so to speak. And he says here, this was the punishment of the Maccabees, that they were kings in the Second Temple period. Ki hayu chasidei elyon. They were very righteous people. If not for them, the Torah and the mitzvot would be forgotten from Israel. And even so, they were punished with a great punishment. Right? Because 4 of them, one after the other, fell at the hands of the enemies. And the punishment came to its height in what the rabbis taught us in Masechet Bava Batra, that anyone who comes and says they're from the house of Hashmonai, right, they're a slave, right? Because everyone was cut off. Everyone was cut off. Right? But all of the descendants of Matityahu, the Hashmonai, did not go digress, did not go against anything. The only thing they did wrong was that they became kings. And they were not from the descendants of Judah, Yehuda, and from the house of David. And they took the kingship, so to speak, and the ruler away completely from the house of Yehuda. And their punishment was midah keneged midah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took over them and their slaves, and they were cut off, right? And so we see from here, just to begin, there's something which we all know, I'm sure, that one of the sins of the Hashmonaim was that they took on the kingship, right? They took on the kingship, and the Ramban, according to Ramban, that was the reason why they were destroyed. And so that's just a beginning. Was their kanaut the problem? Was the fact that they were overzealous the problem? It would seem from here that's not the problem. The problem was simply that they decided to be involved with the kingship. But we're going to keep that in mind as we go through, because I think this is highly, highly relevant to our question of kanaut. And so we're going to begin now with Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi are brothers, as we know. I'm just going to switch now to another screen. Do you all see the Tanakh in front of you? Yeah?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Okay. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first story involving Levi that we're told about in the Tanakh that is perhaps related to Kanaut is the story of Dinah, relevant for the parashiot that we're reading in the last couple of weeks. And Dinah goes out. Yaakov returns from Aram, and he finally comes to a place. He buys a place to live, so to speak, buys the land, and Dinah goes out. And we all know what happens. We're not going to read through the story. Shem takes her and sleeps with her, and then they come out and they want to make a deal with her. And what happens? The brothers come and say like this: Jacob's sons answered Shem and his father Hamor, speaking with guile, the mirma. Rashi says they spoke with chokhmah because they had defiled their sister Dinah. At that point, Dinah obviously is still in the house and is essentially a captive. And then they make the deal that if you circumcise everyone, then we will allow you to marry, and we'll intermarry essentially, and we'll become the same people. It's an interesting story in and of itself. We don't have time this evening to go into it in depth. And they didn't delay in doing this. They did this. They made sure everyone that went out of the gates of the city did this, and they were there. And then what happens? On the third day, when they were in pain, the 2 children of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi, So the brothers of Dinah, and the text specifically says brothers, took their swords and they went to the city, Betach, right? It was in safety, and they killed all the men. They killed Hamor and Shechem according by the sword, and they took Dinah out of their house and they left. And then the children of Yaakov, the other sons, came across and took everything from the city that defiled their sister. So the question really is what do we think about this, right? What have they done the right thing in doing this? What do we know about later on, right? And we'll get to it in a second. We'll get to the bracha of Yaakov. Yaakov says, essentially curses them as part of his bracha for what they've done. But is it a good thing or a bad thing? We also know that the Rambam notes that essentially what they did was the right thing. He says because they didn't establish courts to prosecute the offenders, and establishing courts is a mitzvah b'nei Noach, the entire city was chayav mitah. So according to the Rambam, they did the right thing. Perhaps it wasn't really an act of kanaut, it was an act of justice, and they did what needed to be done. The Ramban goes to town with him and says, how can that be? Yaakov speaks against what they did. And so essentially it is problematic what they did according to the Ramban. But let's just carry on reading. V'yomer Yaakov el Shimon ve'el Levi. Yaakov says to them, and this is one of like the heights of the narrative, Achaltem oti lavisheni b'yoshev haaretz b'kanani b'piriti v'ani metei mispar v'nesfu alai v'ikuni v'nishmadatem ani uveiti. Right? And he says like this, you have brought trouble on me, making me odious amongst the inhabitants. They're few in numbers, so if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed. So the question really is Yaakov bothered by their act, or is he concerned about his military position? It's not clear, although the Ramban feels very strongly that the problem isn't the military position, the problem is the spiritual position, that in their action they could have killed perhaps innocent people, and that would weaken us militarily because we would not have the same level of protection. But be that as it may, the story ends as follows: V'yomru hakazona yaset achotenu. Right? Should our sister be as a prostitute, be as a whore? Right? And again, very poignantly adding this word achot, right? Our sister. And we're going to look at it in a second, that brotherhood comes very clearly into this relationship between Shimon and Levi Levi in and of himself. And the question is this an extreme act? Is it a normal act? And I already just mentioned the Ramban and the Ramban differ on this particular opinion, whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But I think we can all agree that this kind of action would be termed extreme, right? Would be termed perhaps an act of kanaut, although the act itself, and this is important to keep in your mind as we progress, is essentially an act which is, I would say, up in the air. It's not clear whether it's good or bad at the end of the day, right? And the text at the end bears this out very clearly. Yaakov says, how could you do this? And they at the end say, should our sister be made into a whore, right? As though those are the two claims in this story. Those are the two claims driving it forward. Were we right to do it regardless of any other consideration, which is perhaps one of the key features of the Hashmona'i rebellion, right? That regardless of our situation, we're going to fight because that's what needs to happen, which is perhaps one of the markers of I guess you would say, being zealous, right? We don't care what happens, we care what's right. Or were there other considerations? Do we need to consider? Do we need to think about the reality? And essentially this story highlights that element. But I think actually the resolution to that question happens later in the Tanakh itself. And sorry, what we see in the bracha of Yaakov is as follows. He says as follows when he gives the bracha to Shimon and Levi.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, definitely.
Right, I think it's all about male pride, isn't it? And I think what is forgotten in this story is poor Dinah. What happened to Dinah? It's all about the men getting their revenge, and do they actually care about their sister?
Yeah, that's a great.
What in the end? What happens to Dinah? She's a spoilt woman.
Yes.
Nobody's going to want Dina. Her life is wrecked.
Yes.
They're so concerned. Whether what they did was right or wrong, I can't decide. But as I say, it's just about men behaving badly, really.
So that is one of the more modern academic critiques of the story, I think. If you want, I actually wrote an article for an online publication called The Lair House, not exactly on that point, but on the question of Yaakov's silence in the action, which goes some way to resolve, I think, the questions. You can search for it. It's online. But that is a question, whether what they were doing was for them, was it for Dinah? And I actually read it as what they're doing is for Dinah. The entire time they're talking about the brothers, they're talking about their sister. And it's true, the text is written from a perspective of the men, right? But at the same time, that is where the narrative is happening, because Dinah is in the palace, so to speak, being held captive, and so the action focuses on the men. But I believe partly because that's where the action was actually taking place, and that often we see in the Tanakh. But that's a point that is worthwhile considering, right? Where is Dinah's voice in this narrative? And in the time period, would Dinah have been happy with what was going on? And that, in truth, is not dealt with in the Torah explicitly, except that I really feel strongly that the voice of Shimon and Levi is a concern for their sister, right? They do what they do in difficult circumstances because of their sister, right? Because of their sister. But you're right, it's something that isn't discussed explicitly, and there is a lot of research on it in more academic fields. But getting back to the question, how does Yaakov relate to what happened? And he says like this: Shimon veLevi achim klei chamas mecherotehem. Right? Shimon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. But interestingly, here in the JPS, they translate it as they're a pair, but achim, they're brothers. A fundamental nekuda about them is that they're brothers. And what they did was they did something wrong, or they're full of anger. Besodam al tavo nafshi, bekalam al techad kvodi. Right? Let not my person come into their council. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. When angry, they slew men, and when pleased, they maimed ox. Cursed be the anger so fierce, and their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. And this is the bracha of Yaakov, or really the future reading of what happens to Yaakov, and the Rishonim are clear. This is talking about the fact that Levi doesn't have a Nachalah, talking about that Shimon is part of Shevet Yehuda's Nachalah, that they're kind of dispersed. And I'm sure many of you have heard the idea that he was okay with their anger. He just wanted it to be dispersed. He didn't want it to be in one place because it was dangerous. That's an idea that's often spoken about. But we see from here that essentially it is negative, right? Essentially, it's not good what they did, right? Their anger is so much so they lose a Nachalah. So much so they lose a Nachalah. However, if we, well, actually, let's just read here, because it's very interesting as well. We just saw Levi and Shimon are brothers. Brotherhood is their focus. And because of their zealousness, they lose a Nachalah, right? They don't have one of the fundamental elements of Jewish Israelite culture, which is land to live on in the future. However, the same thing interestingly happens with Moshe. And Moshe is from Shevet Levi, as we know, right? And it goes like this: Moshe goes out to who? To his brothers. And he sees their pain. And he sees a Mitzri hitting an Ivri from his brothers. Interestingly, the nekuda, the one of the points of Levi is brotherhood. And that's what happens with Moshe, who's from Shevet Levi. Right? He looks here and there, he sees there's no one, and he kills him. Again, an act of zealousness. because of the love of brothers, etc. And then he goes out in the second day and he sees two people fighting, and he says, why are you hitting him? Who put you as a ruler and judge? And then what happens? And Moshe fears that the thing is known. Moshe flees. He leaves everything he knows. And in fact, when he comes to call his son Gershom, he's told, because I was a ger there, just like the Leviim become gerim. In a very kind of analogous way, Moshe the Levi, who is concerned with brotherhood, who acts zealously for the sake of his brothers, just like Levi and Shimon acted zealously, also essentially doesn't have a nachala, or has to flee, gets a kind of a galut, which is a kind of a curse. However, what we do know is that if you look in Dvarim, what happens with Levi? We know very clearly, right? And Levi said, "Let your Turim and Urim be with your faithful one, who tested Masah, challenged the waters of Merivah, who said of his father and mother, I consider them not. His brothers he disregarded, ignored his own children. Your precepts alone they observed and kept your covenant. They shall teach your laws to Jacob and your instruction to Israel. They shall offer you incense to savor and whole offerings on your altar. Bless, O Lord, his substance and faith in his undertaking. Smite the loins of his foes. Let his enemies rise no more." The bracha of Moshe to Shevet Levi presents an entirely different picture. It presents a picture of someone who is connected to the Mikdash, someone who is connected to teaching and judging, someone who is connected, who doesn't, and the question is, what is the change that happens? What is driving this change between the bracha of Yaakov and the bracha of Moshe? Because essentially, if kanaut is a bad thing, if anger in such a way and acting in such a way is such a bad thing, you would expect it to carry through. What has changed about Levi over that time period? As I'm sure you're aware, there are a number of incidents involving Levi which gave him the kahuna. One of the most important ones is the Chet HaEgel, right? That the nation worship and they have the Egel. And V'yam Moshe Da'am ki paruahu ki paro Aharon l'shimtza b'kamehem. Moshe says, who for Hashem is to me. By the way, the same thing that Matityahu says as he goes out to start the rebellion in Sefer Maccabees. V'yasfu elav kol b'nei Levi, and all of the Levi come. Everyone take their sword and go gate to gate throughout the camp and kill everyone. Ishet achiv, each man his brother, and each man his friend, and each man his relative, and Bnei Levi were the ones that did it, right? Bnei Levi did it. Etc. And so that is one of the elements driving this. One of the concerns is one of the reasons rather is the actions of Levi at Har Sinai, which in of themselves actually was an act of kanot, right? This idea to go and kill people who were sacrificing to the Egel, and they knew this, right? They knew this very clearly. However, I want to suggest there's another interesting parallel, another interesting encounter, which is essentially what is the defining characteristic of Levi, which causes him to be different from Shimon, because that's the other question, right? Why is Shimon differentiated and he doesn't get the bracha at the end, and Levi does get the bracha? There's another incident of Kanaut, which happens with Benot Midian, and I'll jump back to the Tanakh B'Yishutchem, and that is with Pinchas. We know the scene. Bnei Israel come to Arvot Moav, to Shittim, and they engage in promiscuity, perhaps, with the Benot Moav, and there's a whole thing of Avodah Zarah going on. And what happens? what happens? Moshe is getting ready to deal with this. And he says, well, anyone who's coming close to Baal Peor, they should be killed. And then Israel right? Someone does this act mamash in front of everyone. V'yar Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron Kohen v'yakom mitoch ha'ida v'yikach romach biyado. He takes this his spear and he comes to the person and stabs him through the belly, right? And together with the woman. V'yidaber Hashem Moshe Pinchas ben Elazar Kohen eshivet chamatim al ben Israel v'kano et kinati. Right? He was zealous for me. He was zealous for my jealousy. And because of him, I didn't destroy Bnei Israel. And therefore, I give him Briti Shalom, which is, again, one of these famous stories, but again, highlights the kanaut, the zealousness, the fanaticism of Levi, because Pinchas comes from the Kohanim, and Pinchas is a Levi. Now, by the way, I would just say on the outside to keep in mind, it's not at all clear, by the way, the connection between the Kohanim and the Leviim, and whether the Nachala that they're given, so to speak, the work in the Mikdash, is tied as one, the Leviim and the Kohanim, or whether they're actually to be viewed separately. It's a machloket Rashi and Ramban, but we're not going to get into it for now. It's just important to keep in your mind. I'm going with the idea that essentially these elements are actually tied together. However, let's read closely what happens. Veshem ish Yisrael mukeh asher ukat midyanit Zimri ben Salu nasi beit av l'shimoni. Who was the person who was killed? Zimri ben Salu. He was a prince of the house of Shimon, the same tribe with which Levi went out to fight the Midyanim. He was the one who was engaging in this action, and he was the one who essentially the descendant of Bnei Levi killed in order to stop the Magefa. Now, why would he do that? Why would Pinchas do that? Because he's essentially what's guiding him is firstly a love of Am Yisrael, like we saw brotherhood, but secondly a love for truth, a love for emet, so to speak, regardless of what it takes. Regardless of what it takes, and obviously I'm not the only one to say this. There's a midrash on Midrash Tehillim says this about the pasuk Mizmor Levi Shemigu. It goes through a whole list of avot that this mizmor is referring to, and when it says the pasuk vecherpa lo nasal krovo, right? It says ze Pinchas. This refers to Pinchas. Shaya mishivto shel Levi. He was from the tribe of Levi. Vezimri haya mishivto shel Shimon, and Zimri was from the tribe of Shimon. Vekevan shasa oto ma'asen. Since he did that act, miyad hargo. He killed him immediately. Kadei shelo yeh cherpa Yisrael, so that there would not be this kind of disgrace, the disgrace upon Israel. And so what I want to suggest is that the difference between Shimon and Levi is that Levi are true to Hashem no matter what. True to Hashem no matter what. When they see their brother Shimon, so to speak, engaging in this act, Pinchas is the first to stand up and the first to kill, right? The first to kill Zimri, even though he's from the tribe of Shimon, because what's guiding him at the end of the day, even though brotherhood is such an important element of his personality, as we saw, what's guiding him is the search for truth. What's guiding him is his zealousness for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's guiding him is his desire to do the right thing. And I think that is the key to understanding why he therefore gets the Nachala. Why is it that he gets to be close to Hashem? Because he's willing to give everything to it. As we saw in the bracha that Moshe gives him, it says he doesn't see his mother and father. He doesn't see his brothers and sisters. Now, one reading of that is because he needs to work in the Mikdash. He needs to leave them for a long time. But another reading ties very much into what happened in Chet HaEgel, that he was required to kill his closest of kin because they had done the wrong thing, and he was willing to do that. The defining trait of the zealousness, of the fanaticism of Levi is what? Is that they're willing to do it regardless of how much it connects them to their brothers or whatever it is, even though brotherhood is one of their defining traits. even though but how does this then lead to the Maccabees? Why would it be that the Maccabees would be punished for taking the Melucha if we believe that fanaticism is such a good thing, so to speak? So firstly, fanaticism is a good thing, I want to suggest, based on the sources, when it is true arasof, when it's always true, whether it's your brother you're fighting against or whether it's Shem you're fighting against, you are driven by this search for truth and this search to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the question really is, why is it that this is a problem? And as we know, what I want to suggest is as follows, based on the Ramban, also based on the issue of Yerushalmi, that suggests that the reason the reason Kohanim cannot be kings is because they can't have a nachala, right? They can't have a nachala, and it's based on this pasuk in Dvarim, which talks about the king. He will not act towardly towards his fellows, will deviate from the instruction, right? And then it talks about the Levitical priest, the whole tribe shall have no territorial portion with Israel. According to the Yerushalmi, the reason Kohanim can't be kings is because they don't have a nachala. So how are we to understand this in the context of the Hashmonaim? When you deal with being a king, you necessarily get involved in politics. When you have land, you necessarily are involved in this world. And your interests are political interests, or economic interests. They're not the same as interests which are only for Hashem. And so the sin of the Hashmonaim, according to the Ramban, is they sought out the kingdom, but not only because it's just asur to do that, but because the very nature of fanaticism of the Leviim, of the Kanaut of the Leviim, is tied to the fact that it is not tied to this world. It's tied to the fact that it is pure and aiming only for one thing, which is to do Ratzon Hashem Ba'olam. And when they took the Melucha, what they did was they went against this basic fundamental trait of Levi, which is to get caught up in these kinds of concerns. You can't have a Melucha without being tied to this world. And there is room for that. Obviously, we're not saying that the ideal is Levi. Levi is one ideal, but we know the other ideal is Yehuda, David HaMelech, who's able to combine this world and other worlds, Torah and real life. But that's the nature of Yehuda. There's a need for people like Yehuda in the world, and there's a need for Levi in the world. And so when we come to think about the Hashmonaim, we recognize the benefit that they brought for us. As the Ramban said, because of them, Torah wasn't forgotten. As the Rambam says, they returned the Melucha, they returned the kingship to Am Yisrael for hundreds of years. And so it is a positive thing, but at the same time, by compromising their nature as Levi, they compromised their fanaticism. And so just to finish up, when we think about the place of fanaticism in religion, in our own lives, I think it's very complex. I think that part of what the Torah is teaching us, that fanaticism, zeal, is a very positive thing on one level, as long as it's really guided by truth, and truth till the end, right? And together with that, you need to be careful, because if it becomes something which isn't entirely guided by truth, the danger then is that it becomes even worse, because what you're doing is you're using this trait of kanot, of zeal, for something which isn't pure at the end of the day. Now, I'm not obviously suggesting we can all, the kanut is a great thing. Everyone pick up a weapon. Let's go fight whoever it is this evening, right? But I am suggesting, based on what I've said, is that this message, I think, is very, very important in our day and age, right? Because of the world that we live in, and because actually the complexity of the world, and I think that complexity is a good thing. I think being involved in the world is a good thing. I think being Yehuda, so to speak, is a very positive thing. But because of that, we shouldn't lose sight of the need in our own lives to also seek out the Levi, to also seek out this element with kanot, of drive for truth. And it might not be all the time, and it can't be in everything, but there should be, I believe, in all of our lives, this perspective of Levi, of kanot, of zeal, and that should never really be lost on us, I think. And hopefully through all of these things, over Chanuka, that's something we can think about. Where is it that I'm zealous about the Torah and mitzvot? Where is it that I'm able to say that I really am truly dedicated to this one thing, Ada Sof, without thinking about anything else, just what is Hashem demanding of me in that moment? And and it's difficult. It's difficult to think about those things. In Israel, I feel like, to be honest, I feel a little bit more. It's a bit easier for me, right? Dafka, because there are times perhaps we are called upon to not be heroic. We are called upon to forget everything and go, right? When you get a call for an emergency call up, you leave everything and you go, and that kind of guides you. But outside of Israel, it's harder work, so to speak, and I think it's something that we do need to think about. So on that note, I'm happy to questions or comments from people.
Hi,
I just had a question. Oh, sorry. There you go.
Sorry, you go.
Sure.
Vicky, Simon.
Okay, I'll just quickly ask. I got the impression from the way you presented kind of the good version of zealousness, of zeal, that it's kind of a very all or nothing thing. Like it's either you're doing it properly, completely, or not at all. So how can we really just have a bit of it in our lives if the only way to do it is all or nothing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the message is that it's very, very difficult to have it all or nothing, right? In fact, I would even say perhaps in our day and age it's impossible, right? To be the Bechina of Levi. You can be the Bechina of David HaMelech. No, you can't be David HaMelech either, but you can be the Bechina of Yehuda Ad Sof, perhaps, and be zealous towards that derech, but it's very, very hard. But I think we do need to have places in our lives where for that moment we're Levi, right? Or something in our lives that for that moment we're Levi Ad Sof. And in that way, right, take from this Bechina of Levi, even though we're unable to really do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Did the Maccabees sort of their state? When would you say that their status changed from going from like Kanoas Lishma to this this sort of political drive, or not being so? Right.
So probably when historically it happened after the first maybe second or third generation of the Maccabean kings. Right. Historically, they became really assimilated. But I would suggest, based on this, that it started the second they took on the Melucha, because by its very nature, the Melucha for Levi shatters this purity, Perhaps they had no choice, right? But we saw, according to the Ramban, that regardless whether they had no choice or not, because of that they received this punishment. Because by its very nature, the Melucha involves. Actually, it works very well in Hebrew. The melucha is meluchlach, right? No, but the being involved in kingly matters in this world is this world. You can't escape it. There's no purity in that sense, right? You need to deal with things like that. So we've touched on a number of points, though. So that's not the only point. But I think that the drive of Levi should guide us, especially on Chanuka. And essentially, as the Ramban says, without that drive, the Torah would have been forgotten from Am Yisrael, right? There's a big, it's more complicated, I think. Shmuel, did you want to say something?
So I was going to ask, is it very different for us? Because at the time of Hanukkah, I mean, you were fighting a war against Greek culture. So any compromise with anything Greek was like almost, going over to the enemy. Whereas now we're just not facing that kind of threat from any kind of Western culture, and we are facing a threat, but not in the same kind of way. And therefore, is it appropriate to be fanatical, to be extreme in that sense?
It's a good question. I think you're right. I think the Maccabean rebellion, the Hashmonaim, fought when the Gezerot came in, right? When the decrees came in, when they did destroy the temple but made it impure, and brought in Avodah Zarah to Yerushalayim. But the process of Hellenization in Israel is quite similar to what is happening today, right? This kind of slow assimilation and elements within Judaism arguing for more assimilation and bringing a gymnasium in. And I think it's there's not one answer as to if our situation is similar exactly, but you're right. As I said in the beginning, the Hashmonim were facing a real enemy, right? It's not, and I don't think we should be careless in comparing it directly, right? And I'm sure you're aware, Shmuel, there are voices in the Jewish community that refer to our period as that, right? And obviously that is not true, right? This is not a case of Shmad in any sense of the imagination. Quite the opposite, actually. But with that, I think there should be within this world where I do think it is important to be part of the world and to take from it and to interact with it and to have meaningful interactions with it. I think we do need to reserve a place for Kanaut, because actually without that, it's very easy to lose semblance of the boundaries, right? And I think that is important, actually.
And Kanaut isn't about just physical Kanaut, right? So we've not got a physical enemy at the moment, more like you're saying, but it's about also being Kanaut in terms of things that you stand up for and you believe in that aren't necessarily physical things.
Yes,
just,
exactly.
That are important to you, which I think there is a place for.
Yes, I'm not saying we should take weapons, I'm saying in our Avodat Hashem, I do think it is good to have a place that is uncompromising, right? Again, not in everything, and it depends on your particular Masorah and your Rav and everything else. But I think there does need to be that element of your Avodat Hashem, which is Adasof, without considering, this is Adasof, because that's an important message from Chanukah in and of itself, right? And I'm talking on a spiritual level, right? Not on a physical level.
Is that a sort of mindset? Is that why people were still going to shul during lockdown? Is it coming from that point of view, in the sense that they believe that it's a spiritual? I don't know. Is that what, might that be what it's coming from?
Perhaps. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what it's coming from. I don't think it's easy to judge. Again, it only makes sense if you say this is Shat Hashmad, halachically, right? I don't want to get into other people's kishkas, but halachically it doesn't make sense unless you say it's Shat Hashmad, and therefore we do it to preserve, to be honest. Yeah, again, you have to be careful as well, because part of, for instance, the criticism of Shimon and Levi, according to the Ramban, was that they didn't act properly, right? And sometimes your zeal leads you to act inappropriately. So, for instance, I didn't mention, according to some Midrashim, Shimon married Dinah, right? So you might say that's taking the notion of brotherhood to the extreme, right? He really brotherhood was his guy, but it's taken to the wrong place. And so you also have to be careful with that. The whole world is a very narrow bridge. You need to balance things very carefully. Let's not set dumb. Simon, do you have a question?
No, it was Vicky.
Sorry, one before. I was just going to say that I guess you could take the whole concept of kind of a bit further with the Shimon and Levi example with Pinchas. So Pinchas is, was for Hashem, and that's why he kind of didn't like what he saw and kind of put an end to it. But then Shimon's was the opposite. He had kind of, but for the other reason. Like he wanted to, I can't remember what the prince was called, he wanted to be with Cosby, and that's kind of up, but in the wrong way. So it's kind of more of like an opposite between them in terms of why Shimon didn't end up getting any land, and Levi kind of got something.
Right. Yeah, you can say that. Interesting. Okay, so on that point, I guess we'll end. I think something to take with us on Chanukah, thinking about what's the kanaut in our lives, right? What are the things that mamash we're kanai about? Because I think it is an important trait, and it also is an important educational kind of experience for someone to really search about what really are the things they care about, that they're willing to do anything for, in terms of Avodat Hashem, and perhaps through Chanukah, this Chanukah is something that we can think about. Where in our lives does the Levi come out? Where in our lives does this kanaut come out, where we're true really for what it's clear to us and it's true, and we give it our all. So on that note, I wish you well, and I'll hopefully see some of you tomorrow evening.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Thank you.